And again, today's lesson is going to be going over problem 23-1B. So I'm going to bring up Cengage on the board for you. And so you should be able to see problem 23-1B now. And what we're going to be doing in problem 23-1B is we're going to be talking about something that we call direct materials and direct labor variance analysis. Now, all through this course, we've been talking about manufacturing cost. You'll remember your manufacturing cost were your direct materials, your direct labor, and your factory overhead. So what we did in the very last chapter that we covered was we covered budgets. And a part of this chapter is going to be comparing budgeted amounts with what actually happens to your company. And that's what we're going to call variance analysis. We're going to look at what happened, what actually happened, and we're going to compare it to what we think that should have happened. So we're comparing it really to the budgets. And so in this particular problem, we're going to be looking at just direct materials and direct labor variances today. I'm going to save the factory overhead variances for you for another session. So we're going to try to keep this as simple as we possibly can. First of all, you need to know a little bit about the company that the problem is having you to calculate the materials and the labor variances for. This particular company is going to be a clothing manufacturer, and they're going to manufacture clothing in a small manufacturing facility. Their manufacturing company has 25 employees, and each employee presently provides 40 hours of productive labor per week. And so the problem has given you some information about what happens during a production week. And first of all, it tells you that they have come up with a standard wage per hour. This standard wage per hour is what they think that they should have been paying their employees during this period of time. Where they would get that standard wage per hour is they would go to their human resources department and ask them before the period of time started to give them some type of budgeted information about the amount of wages that their employees will be earning per hour. So what this standard wage per hour means is that this employer was thinking that $12 per hour is what they should be paying their employees. Now, when we talk about standard cost just means what the company should have been paying, and usually that's based on some type of budgeted amount that they would come up with before the period of time starts that they're going to measure what happens to their company in. So the standard wage per hour that they've come up with is $12 per hour. This is what they think that they should be paying their employees per direct labor hour. Also, they have come up with a standard labor time per unit. This is the amount of time that they think should take to produce one unit that they are manufacturing. And so here you can see that they think it's going to take them approximately 12 minutes per unit that they're manufacturing. And this is what we call the standard labor time per unit. So their employees, it's going to take them about 12 minutes to manufacture the clothing that they are anticipating that they're going to be manufacturing this period of time. So this standard labor of time is really like a budgeted amount that the company would come up with before they actually start the operations for that period of time. So they're saying, well, we've gone to our production department, and our production department thinks it should take 12 minutes per unit of, it takes 12 minutes of time to make one unit that we are producing, and that's going to be their budgeted amount of time. They have also given you a standard number of yards of fabric per unit. So what they're saying is, we think that the number of yards it's going to take to produce one unit is 5 yards. Again, this is a budgeted amount, and they probably would go to the production folks to ask before the accounting period starts what they think the number of yards should be that it takes to produce one unit. They've also come up with a standard price per yard of fabric, which is $5 per yard. And this standard price is what they think the fabric should cost them during that period of time. They will probably go to their purchasing department for this type of information. All of the standard items that we've talking about the company has to come up with these before they start production. And so these are budgeted amounts. Then what this problem has given you is what's actually happened. You can see the actual price per yard of fabric was $5.10. The actual yards of fabric used during the week were 26,200. The actual number of units produced during the week was 5,220. The actual wage per hour was $11.80. The actual hours for the week that they incurred were 1,000 hours. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this information and we're going to compare what actually happened to what they thought should have happened. So we're going to compare our actual amounts with the standard amounts for a period of time. So in the first requirement that they're asking you for, in requirement A, they're asking you to determine the standard cost per unit for the direct materials first, and then we're going to do this, or we're going to determine the standard cost per unit for the direct labor. There are formulas that we can use to help us with this. And so it tells you also to make sure you read carefully that you're going to round the cost per unit to 2 decimal places. So the first thing we're going to look for is the direct materials standard cost per unit. So in order for us to determine what the standard cost per unit would be for the direct materials, we would need to know what the direct materials price was going to be as far as the budgeted amount that they had expected for the direct materials, And we would also need to be able to know what the standard amount of the material was going to take to produce 1 unit. Now this is for 1 unit only that they're looking for. And so if you look in your standard information here, what you're going to need to know, because we're talking about the materials, the standard wage wouldn't make any difference, or the standard labor time per unit wouldn't make any difference. What we're going to be looking at is the standard number of yards of fabric per unit, which was 5 yards, and the standard price per yard. That's what will help us to determine the standard cost per unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my calculator. I'll move it here where it's out of the eyesight of what information that you need. Remember, looking for the direct materials standard cost per unit, so it's about materials. So we would need to know how many yards of fabric that this company anticipated that they were using per unit, which is 5 yards. And we will multiply the 5 yards times the standard price that we are expecting that we will be paying for the fabric, which is $5. So if you multiply 5 yards times $5, it's going to give you a dollar amount of $25 as the cost of the standard cost of the direct materials per unit. So your direct materials standard cost, standard just means it's their budgeted amounts, is what we think the materials should cost per unit, is going to be the amount of 25. Again, we got this by taking 5 standard number of yards of fabric per unit and multiplying it by the standard price per yard of fabric of $5. 5 yards times $5 is $25 that it is going to cost us, that we are expecting that it's going to cost us. This is what it should cost us during this period of time. So the direct labor standard cost per unit is going to be based on what's happening for your labor. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to look at the information that they've given you about standard cost for the labor. First of all, we would need to look at our standard wage per hour amount, which is $12. This is what we're going to pay our employees per hour. We would also need to look at the time that it takes us to produce 1 unit. What you have to recognize about this problem is they tell you that the time it takes is 12 minutes. We want to first convert those minutes to parts of an hour. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our 12 minutes and we're going to divide that 12 minutes by 60 minutes in an hour. And that will give us 0.2 parts of an hour that it's going to take to produce 1 unit. So 20% of an hour is what it's going to take to produce 1 unit. Again, I got the 20% by taking 12 minutes and dividing it by 60 minutes in an hour, we're converting it to parts of an hour. My parts of an hour will be 20% of 1 hour is how much it's going to take to produce 1 unit. That's how much time it's going to take to produce 1 unit. Once we know the time that it takes to produce 1 unit, we're going to multiply that time by $12, which is the standard wage per hour. So 0.2, 20% of an hour times $12 per hour will tell us what the standard direct labor cost will be per unit. And it's going to be 2.4 or $2.40 is the direct labor standard cost per unit. Again, when we talk about standards, we're talking about what we had originally budgeted. This is what it should have cost us. So to determine the total standard cost per unit, we would add the direct materials standard cost per unit to the direct labor standard cost per unit. So I'm going to add both of these together, and it's going to give me $27.4 or $27.40 is our total standard cost per unit. This is our budgeted amounts. Yes, I'm hearing a question here. Go ahead. Does someone have a question? I think somebody might have accidentally raised your hand.
Hi, yes. Can you explain how to get the direct labor standard cost per unit again? Because my computer just something happened and I couldn't really hear it.
Which one?
It's
Again?
the direct labor standard cost per unit.
Okay.
You say something that 20%, and I don't really. How
Right.
do you
The 20, you're taking the standard labor time per unit, which is 12 minutes, and dividing it by 60 minutes in 1 hour. That would give you 20% of an hour. It takes 20% of an hour to manufacture 1 unit. That 20% per hour is going to be multiplied by $12, the standard wage per hour, to get the $2.40. So again, I'm taking 12 minutes. That's what they gave me here as the standard labor time per unit. I'm going to convert 12 minutes to an hour. So we want to divide 12 minutes by 60 minutes. That will give you 20 parts of an hour, or 20% of 1 hour. Then I'm going to multiply that by $12, and that will give you $2.40 as our direct labor standard cost per unit. Clear up your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. All right. Now, so the total standard cost per unit is simply the two of these combined. What they're saying is what they think it should cost us to produce 1 unit of clothing is $27.40 per unit. All right, these are standard costs. These are budgeted amounts. What you're going to do at the end of the accounting period is you're going to collect the information about what actually happened. The actual amounts are given here. Then we're going to compare what actually happened to what the standard was that we set to see if there are any differences. The differences are what we call variances. And so there are going to be variances for direct materials that you're going to need to learn to calculate. So I'm going to stop sharing this for just a minute because I want to go to my whiteboard and give you some notes on how to calculate these variances. And so I'm going to stop sharing this for just a minute. I'm going to go to the whiteboard. So bear with me just a second while I get there. You should be seeing a white screen now with which I'm going to write down the formulas that are so important in this chapter. So bear with me. It's going to take me just a few minutes to type these out. The first variance that we're going to learn about is the direct materials price variance. So we're going to learn about the direct materials price variance first. To calculate the direct materials price variance, you need to know what your actual price is. The actual direct materials price, we're going to look for that in our problem. I like to abbreviate that as AP for the actual price because sometimes when I'm writing all of this out, I like to abbreviate it. So I want you to know that the actual direct materials price is abbreviated as actual price. That amount will most likely be given to you. On the next part of this, you're going to subtract out the standard direct materials price. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for our actual direct materials price. We're going to subtract our standard direct materials price. And what that's going to give us is a variance. And this variance is going to be multiplied the variance is going to be multiplied by the actual quantity. And what that will give you is the um, direct materials price variance. So to find your direct materials price variance, you need to know what your actual direct materials price is, and that's usually going to be given to you. You're going to subtract out your standard direct materials price, which I'm abbreviating that as SP, and that's going to give you a variance. The difference between these two is a variance. The variance will be multiplied by the actual quantity of direct materials that you have used, and that will give you the direct materials price variance. That's our first variance that you will need to be able to calculate. So you might want to write this down on a sheet of paper so that you'll have it in front of you, so that when we get ready to do the problem again, you'll have your formulas in front of you, and so you'll be able to ask questions if you have any based on what you've got in front of you. So I would suggest that you write this down. That's how we calculate direct materials price variance. There is a second variance that is related to direct materials, and it's what we call the direct materials quantity variance. So bear with me while I type this in. And so to calculate the direct materials quantity variance, we're going to need to know what the actual quantity is, the actual quantity of materials used, what that amount is, and we're going to subtract from that the standard quantity of materials used. So we are subtracting our standard quantity of materials used from our actual quantity of materials used, and what that's going to do is that's going to give us a variance. And we're going to multiply that variance times the standard price of materials. And that's going to give me our direct materials quantity variance. So to find your direct materials quantity variance, we're going to take the actual quantity of materials used. We're going to subtract the standard quantity of materials used. That's going to give us a variance. Then we will multiply that by the standard direct materials price, and that will give you the direct materials quantity variance. This is a formula that you will need to know how to use to be able to determine the direct materials quantity variance. These are the quantity variances for direct materials. There are two of them. And what management is going to use this information for is to help them to make decisions about the company. One of the things that they sometimes do not give to you, class, in your problems is the standard quantity of materials used. So I want to show you how to determine the standard of quantity of materials used. So I'm going to add this as an additional information. To determine the standard quantity of materials used, you're going to take the standard you're going to take the standard uh, number of yards in this case, the standard number of yards of fabric, and then you're going to multiply that times the actual units produced. To get the standard number of yards of fabric, you're going to multiply that times the actual units produced. This is how you get the standard of quantity of materials used. So sometimes this part right here is not given to you. You're going to have to find it. So to determine the standard quantity of materials used, you take your standard number of yards, in this case of fabric, you're going to multiply that by the actual units produced, and that will give you the standard quantity of materials used. Also, you need to note if the actual is more than the standard, the variance will be unfavorable. If the actual is more than the standard, the variance will be unfavorable. Because what you're saying is you budgeted a certain amount If it's actually more than what you budgeted, the variance is going to be unfavorable. On the other hand of that, if the actual is less than the standard, the variance will be favorable. Or in other words, if the actual amount is less than the budgeted amount, the variance will be favorable. Another thing that you're going to need to note is in Cengage, use a minus sign in front of the variance if it is favorable. Now that sounds a little strange, but you have to remember that the Cengage is a application program in a computer, and the only way it can know that it's favorable is if you put a minus sign in front of it. It's just one of those things in Cengage that you're going to have to remember to do. So in Cengage, I want you to use a minus sign in front of the variance if it is favorable. All right, so what we're going to be doing in the first part of this next part of the problem is we're going to be looking at the direct materials price variance. What you're going to look for is the actual materials price, which will probably be given to you. You're going to subtract out your standard direct materials price, which may be given to you, and the difference is going to be a variance. If the actual amount is more than the standard amount, the variance will be unfavorable, as our notes tell us. If the standard amount is more than the actual amount, it will be favorable as a variance. And whatever the variance is, it'll either be favorable or unfavorable. We will need to multiply that amount by the actual quantity of direct materials, and that will give you the direct materials price variance. If you're determining your quantity variance for direct materials, your actual quantity of materials used less the standard quantity of materials used will give you a variance. If the actual amount is more than the standard amount, the variance is unfavorable, and you would multiply that unfavorable amount by the standard direct materials price, and that will give you the direct materials quantity variance. If the standard quantity of materials used is more than the actual price, this will become favorable, and that favorable is a negative amount that would be multiplied by the standard direct materials price amount, which is your quantity variance. Now, sometimes the standard quantity will not be given. If it's not given, you're going to have to find based on determining the standard amount of the materials that are used. In this case, we're using fabric to make our products. And so the standard number of yards of fabric times the actual units produced will give you the standard quantity of materials used. Now, class, I like to abbreviate these, so in the future, I might abbreviate the actual quantity as AQ, so I won't have to write all this stuff out again. And I might abbreviate the standard quantity as SQ. And if you want to, instead of using variance here, you could just say it's the difference. The difference between the actual and the standard will give you the variance. And then your standard direct materials price, this would be SP. I don't have a way to write that in right now, class. So I can't figure out how to correct something after I've entered it in. So just bear with me. So you might see a SP after this to stand for the standard price. So it's the standard price times the variance gives you the direct materials quantity variance. Another thing that I need to mention before we leave this particular whiteboard space is that the total of the direct materials price variance plus the total of the direct materials quantity variance will equal your direct materials variances. So sometimes they add these two together to get the total direct materials variance. What these amounts tell us is how well the company did as far as what they have budgeted and what actually happened. If the variances are favorable or unfavorable, we will want to look as management to try to determine why those amounts were favorable or unfavorable. This will help us to direct our operations in the future. So the whole purpose of doing these formulas is to tell management how they can better direct the operations of the company. So if it's the direct materials price variance that we're calculating, we would know to go to our purchasing department if the variance is favorable or unfavorable to see why that happened. If there's a favorable variance, we may repeat that performance again in the future. If the variance is unfavorable, we might want to look for ways to improve our variance the next period of time. So all of these variances are about helping management make decisions about the company. The same would be true for the direct materials quantity variance. Rather than going to the purchasing department, we would probably go to our production department because they would be responsible for using the materials and converting them into our finished product. So we would want to ask them at the end of the period, once we've calculated our variances, if the variances were favorable, we want to know what they did to improve operations during that period of time, and we might want to continue with those same operations. If they are unfavorable variances, we might want to ask them why those variances were unfavorable. So I hope that you've got all of this written down. If you don't, you can look back at the video again to see this again. But once I go out of here, I don't think there's any way for me to keep what I've got written on this whiteboard. So make sure you refer to your notes while I am going through the remainder of the second part of this problem. I may have to go back out and give you some more notes. I know I will, to calculate your direct labor variances. but these are variances that are just for our direct materials. So I'm going to go out of here for just a minute, and I'm going to try to get back to where we were. So bear with me. It might take just a few minutes for me to get it switched back and forth. So I'm going to stop the whiteboard, and I'm going to try to pick back up where we were before. Bear with me just a moment. Let me see if I can find it again. Well, it's gone. How about that? So let me see if I can pull it up where you can see it. Okay, you should be able to see your problem again. Can you see it, class? Would somebody please turn their microphone on and answer me? I hear a hand. Do you see what I'm seeing?
Yes,
Do
we
you
can.
see the cent
Yes.
gauge brought back up? Thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to check to make sure. We're working on part B, the price variance we're going to look at first, which is your direct materials price variance. So use those formulas that you wrote down. What we're going to start with is our actual price of our direct materials. So I need to look for my actual price of my fabric per yard, which is $5.10. I'm going to pull my calculator up. I'm going to put in $5.10. That's my actual price. From that, I'm going to subtract my standard price. My standard price per yard of fabric is $5. That was given to you. So I'm going to subtract my standard price of $5 from the actual price of $5.10, and that will give me a 10-cent variance. Now this variance is going to be unfavorable. The reason that it is unfavorable is my actual price was more than what I had budgeted for. The actual price was $5.10. My budgeted amount was $5. The difference is 10 cents. That variance is going to be unfavorable. The variance amount is going to be multiplied by the actual quantity of fabric used. The actual quantity of yards of fabric that was used is 26,200. So we're multiplying that 10-cent unfavorable variance times 26,200. What that will give you is 2,620. And because the actual price was more than what we budgeted for, it's going to become unfavorable. Do you understand what I did there? This is my direct materials price variance. So you're going to take the 510, subtract it from $5, that leaves you with 10 cents that is unfavorable. I'm going to multiply that by 26,200 yards, and that will give you the 2620, which is unfavorable. The next variance for our materials is the quantity variance. Again, use your formula for the quantity variance. What we're going to do is we're going to take the actual quantity of 26,200 yards that was given to us. We're going to compare this with the standard quantity of yards that they used during that week. We don't know what the standard quantity of yards are, so we're going to have to determine the standard of quantity of yards that they were expecting to use during that time period. I'm going to determine my standard yards since it's not given to us first. So in our calculator, we're going to start with the standard number of yards that it's going to take of fabric to produce 1 unit. Notice they gave you the standard number of yards of fabric per unit is 5 yards. We're going to multiply that by the actual number of units produced. The actual units produced is 5,220 units. When I multiply that, that gives me 26,100, and that is my standard yards. I'm going to compare my standard yards to my actual yards. My actual yards was 26,200. So in your formula, you're going to take 26,200, that was your actual quantity of materials that you used during that time period. We're going to subtract out the standard quantity of materials that we thought that we were going to use, which is 26,100. That will give us a difference of 100 yards. That 100 yards is unfavorable. The variance is unfavorable because my actual quantity of 6,200 yards is different from my standard quantity of 26,100 yards. There was 100 yards more that we used than we thought that we were going to use. That 100 yards is unfavorable. We're going to have to multiply that by the standard price, and the standard price of the fabric is $5. So when I multiply 100 times $5, it's going to give me 500. And we've already determined that that too was going to be unfavorable. It was unfavorable because my actual quantity of fabric used was more than what I thought it should have been at 26,100. Difference is 100 yards. That is the variance that we have to multiply by the standard price, which was given at $5. This is what it gives you as the amount of the direct materials quantity variance. The total direct materials cost variance then is the total of both of these. Because both of these variances were unfavorable, the total amount will be unfavorable, and we would simply combine these two amounts together at 2620 plus 500, which equals 3120. All right, now what we can determine from this information is that our original amount that we had anticipated to pay for the materials was unfavorable. So because our purchasing department would be responsible for buying the materials, we would want to go back to the purchasing department and ask them why the amount was more than what they had expected. And the purchasing department might simply say, well, there was an increase in the price because the supplier went up on their materials cost. And so in the future, you might want to hunt for another supplier that could give you materials that cost less. So we use this information to help management make decisions about the company. Our direct materials quantity variance, we would go back to our production department because they would be the ones that are using the materials, and we would want to ask them why this amount was favorable or unfavorable. In this case, it was unfavorable. So we would go to our production department and say, well, you thought that it was the budgeted amount was going to be a certain amount, the actual amount was more than that. Why did that happen? And so the production department might simply say, well, we hired some new employees and it took more material to make the products than what we had anticipated. Or they might say, well, the materials that we got were inferior. So we had to use more materials than what we thought we did. Anyway, the variances are used by management to help them to determine what happened between what they had budgeted and what the actual amount is. The total direct materials cost variance was 3120. That was unfavorable. That doesn't give us a whole lot of information by itself. That's why we break them down into direct materials price variances and direct materials quantity variances. So it'll help management to zero in on what happened during that time period and will help them to direct their operations in the future. Are you okay with what I've done for this first part, or excuse me, for part B? Do I have any questions about that? I'm not hearing any questions. So again, I'm going to stop sharing this with you and I'm going to go back to the whiteboard because I've got some more formulas that I need to give you before you can work on part C. And part C is about labor variances. So I want to stop here and give you some information about the labor variances. So I don't hear any questions, so I'm going to stop sharing this. Hold tight. We're not through quite yet. We need to get back to our whiteboard. And you should be able to see the whiteboard now. And I'm going to give you some more notes. This time going to give you notes about the direct labor variances. There are going to be two of them. The first one we're going to do is the direct labor rate variance. And we're going to calculate the direct labor rate variance by taking the actual direct labor rate, which I'm going to call that AR for short, the actual rate. And once we know the actual direct labor rate, we're going to subtract from it the standard rate, and we'll call that SR. And when we subtract that, it's going to leave us with a variance, or a difference is what we call the variance. So, and the variance that we get, we're going to multiply that by the standard excuse me, we're going to multiply that by the actual hours times the actual hours. And that's going to give you the direct labor rate variance. So your actual direct labor rate would be subtracted from your standard direct labor rate, and that gives you a variance that you're going to multiply by the actual hours. And that's the actual direct labor hours that we're talking about here. And that will give you the direct labor rate variance. That's your first direct labor variance. The second labor variance that we need to talk about is what we call the direct labor time variance. Sorry about that. Direct labor time variance. And the direct labor time variance is going to be your actual hours, direct labor hours, which I like to call AH. And we're going to subtract from that we're going to subtract from that our standard hours. I like to abbreviate that with an SH. Difference between these is the variance, and we're going to multiply that by the standard direct labor rate. That will give you the direct labor time variance. So the variance times the standard direct labor rate is going to give you the direct labor time variance. And just like before, we might want to note that the standard direct labor hours sometimes are not given to you, sometimes they are. And what we can do to determine the standard direct labor hours is we'll take the standard time that it takes to produce one unit, and you're going to multiply that by the actual units produced. So to find the standard direct labor hours, you can determine it by taking the standard time it takes to produce one unit. That should say one there. One unit. Oh, yes. Lynn, you got your hand raised?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to turn on my mic. I can't see anything past the direct labor time variance. It's the actual less the standard. Anything past that I cannot see.
Okay. Is you can't see it now? Is it
No,
just
ma'am.
taking time? Well, I don't know what the problem is for that. I can see it on my screen. I'm
I
not
don't know if
sure.
I don't know if I'm the only one or not, but I just can't see it. So can you say it one more time so I can write it down, please?
Yes, I definitely will. And you're
Okay.
talking about the direct labor time variance. Is that what you want?
No, no, no. I cannot see to determine standard direct labor hours.
Oh, okay. All right. It's the standard time it takes to produce one unit times the actual units produced.
Okay, say it one more time just to make sure.
The standard time it takes to produce one unit times the actual units produced.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know that. I'm not sure why, unless I just don't have it spaced out far enough, and I don't know how to do that. I'm so sorry, class. This is so awkward.
Yeah, no, you're good. Thank you so much.
But anyway, that's how you calculate it. All right. So sometimes they'll give you the standard direct labor hours and sometimes they won't give it to you. So you can calculate that standard time by taking the standard time it takes to produce 1 unit times the actual units produced. That will give you the standard direct labor hours that this company has used for this period of time. All right, now I hope you've got this written down. I want to go back to Cengage, so bear with me as I try to get back to where I was before. It'll take just a few seconds, I hope. I don't know why it won't come up like I want it to. Hold on, class. I'm going to try to get it to you. I think it just might take a minute or so. You should be able to see it now. All right, we're working on part C. We're determining the rate variance first, the direct labor rate variance. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to, of course, look at our information and we'll want to make those calculations. So I'm going to go up to the top so we can see what we're doing. To calculate the direct labor rate variance, you need your actual direct labor rate, and that's right here where it says actual wage per hour is $11.80. I'm going to take the actual direct labor wages and I'm going to subtract that from the standard amount for the direct labor wages. Notice the standard amount, the budgeted amount, was more than what actually happened here. So when I subtract the $12, oops, let me try that again. 1180 minus $12 is a negative 20 cent. What that negative amount tells you is that it's favorable. And remember, when you are writing in your favorable amount, you have to put a minus sign in front of it because it's favorable. I know that sounds strange because normally when we put a minus sign in front of it, it means a negative amount. But this is not necessarily a negative amount here because the variance is favorable. It's a good thing. Maybe I should have said that. It is definitely a negative amount. When the variances are favorable, it usually most of the time, it means that something good has happened. And so what's happened is my actual direct labor wages was less than what I thought it was going to be. So the amount is 20 cent favorable. I have to multiply that 20 cent favorable amount by the actual hours. The actual hours are given at 1,000 hours. So when I multiply that, it will give me a minus 200. That is what we call the favorable variance for this company. Is there any question about what I did there? All Now, in the direct labor time variance, a lot of times they won't give you the standard number of hours. In this case, they did not give us our standard number of hours. What they told us was it takes 12 minutes to produce 1 unit. So we had to convert that, if you will remember, to hours. So first of all, you'll take your 12 minutes and divide it by 60 minutes. That will tell you the time it takes to produce 1 unit, which is 20 parts of an hour. Then to find the total standard hours we would have used, we would have to multiply that 20% rate by the actual number of units produced. So I'm going to find my standard hour first. Notice you're not going to put that in your formula first, but they don't give you the standard hours, so you have to determine those. So let's determine the standard hours by taking the number of minutes that it takes to produce 1 unit, which is 12 minutes. We're going to divide that by 60 minutes in an hour. That gives us 20 parts of an hour that we're going to multiply by the actual unit produced. The actual units produced is 5,220 units. That will give me 1,044 standard hours. You might want to write that down. 1,044 is the standard hours. We're going to compare the standard hours to the actual hours. Notice the actual hours was less. So again, this labor time variance is going to be favorable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my calculator 1,000 actual hours. I'm going to subtract from it the standard hours that I just found, which was 1,044. That gives me a negative variance, which means it's going to be favorable, that I have to multiply by the standard rate, which was $12 per hour. And that's going to give us a total amount of a negative 528,000, excuse me, $528. And that's going to be the favorable amount for this company. Do you understand how I got the direct labor time variance? To find the total direct labor cost variance, we would combine both of these together. Because they are favorable variances, they are going to be negative amounts. So we're going to add the 528 direct labor time variance with the 200 favorable direct labor rate variance, and that's going to give us a total negative amount of $728. It's still going to be favorable because both of these were favorable. Does that make sense to you? Now, what we can figure out from these variances is that our direct labor rate variance was favorable, and so we go to our HR department and we say, well, our direct labor rate variance was favorable. Why did this happen? And they may tell you that the direct labor rate variance was favorable because we hired some employees and we paid them less money. Or they might tell you that it just didn't take as much time as we thought in producing those units. So you might want to go back to the production department and determine why it didn't take as much time to produce the units as they thought it would. And the production department might say, well, we had better materials to work with, or they might say that, we had more skilled labor, that our employees were better than what we thought they were going to be. And, but anyway, the management would want to go back and see why these variances were favorable, and then they would want to make up their mind as to whether they should continue on with operations as they are, or if they're going to modify operations and get an even better favorable variance next time. So some mathematical variances that management can use. They're not the only way to determine whether a company's done good or not. You would want to definitely take into consideration some things that are not mathematical when you're making decisions about how to operate your company. And we'll talk more about those as we go on through. Is there any question about this first problem that I have done? Yes. Go ahead.
Can you do again the direct labor time variance? I got confused because I'm trying to do it, and I know you divided by 60 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's the same as what we did before. I'm sorry, somebody else was asking a question too? Or making a comment? All right, I can only hear one of you at a time, so let me answer. I believe it was Nuri that was asking the question. So first of all, you have to find the amount of hours that it takes to produce one unit. To do that, we take 12 minutes and divide it by 60. So it takes us 20 parts of 1 hour to produce one unit. We actually produced 5,220 units. So you have to multiply the 20 parts of an hour times 5,220, and that will give you the standard time. The standard time for this problem was 1,044 total hours. Again, it's 20 parts of an hour times the actual number of units produced. So if we put in 12 minutes divided by 60 minutes, it gives us 20 parts of an hour times the actual units produced of 5,220, and that will give you 1,044 hours. That 1,044 hours is your standard direct labor hours, which would be compared with the actual hours of 1,000 hours. Because my actual hours were less than what I thought it should have been, the difference is 44 hours. That's favorable. I have to multiply the 44 hours times the standard rate, which was $12, and that gives us 528, which is the variance amount for the direct labor time variance. It gives you that $528. It's a negative amount because it was favorable. the actual hours were less than the standard hours. And that's why it's a negative amount here or a favorable amount of $528. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions about anything that I've done today? I don't hear any other questions. So I'm going to stop sharing this with you and I'm going to stop recording